I'm Melissa Henderson, 28 years old, and I'm standing in front of the house that I've been paying the mortgage on for the past 5 years. Today, my parents just handed over the deed to my sister Jennifer as a wedding gift. Jennifer has never paid a single dollar toward this house. And me? I put in $200,000 of my savings and salary to save this house from foreclosure. Now I'm watching my sister clutch those papers, grinning from ear to ear next to her fiancé Brandon, while my parents tell me this was just a family loan. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you think family should keep their promises, and don't forget to subscribe because trust me, you won't believe how this story unfolds. Now, let me take you back to where this nightmare began. 5 years ago, my life was finally coming together. I had just landed a stable job as a registered nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, making $65,000 a year. I was 23, living in a small apartment, and saving up for my own place when everything changed. My parents, George and Linda Henderson, called me over for what they said was an urgent family meeting. I walked into their living room to find them sitting at the kitchen table with stacks of papers spread out, both looking like they'd aged 10 years overnight. Dad cleared his throat and started explaining their situation. The small construction business he'd run for 20 years had taken a massive hit during the economic downturn. They'd missed 3 mortgage payments on their 4-bedroom house in Maple Grove, the house where I'd grown up, where Jennifer and I had celebrated every birthday and holiday. The bank was threatening foreclosure within 60 days. They owed $47,000 in back payments, plus fees and penalties that kept growing every day. Mom started crying as she explained how embarrassed they were, how they'd never imagined they'd be in this position at 52 and 50 years old. They'd always been proud, hard-working people. Dad had built that house himself in 1998, putting in every nail and board with his own hands. The thought of losing it was destroying them both. Jennifer was in her senior year at State University, studying marketing, and they couldn't bear to burden her with this news during her final semester. That's when they asked me to help. They needed someone to co-sign on a loan modification and help with the monthly payments until Dad's business recovered. The mortgage payment was $2,800 a month, plus insurance and property taxes brought it to around $3,200. It was more than half my take-home pay, but seeing my parents so devastated, I couldn't say no. These were the people who had sacrificed everything to give Jennifer and me a good childhood. Dad had worked 16-hour days, Mom had taken night shifts as a grocery store clerk to pay for our school clothes and supplies. I agreed to help, but I wanted everything in writing. We went to the bank together, and I was added as a co-borrower on the loan modification. Dad shook my hand and promised me something that I thought was legally binding because of how seriously he said it. He looked me in the eyes and said, "Melissa, this house will be yours when your mother and I pass away. You're saving our legacy, and it will become your legacy." Mom nodded and hugged me, saying I was their angel and that they'd never forget what I was doing for the family. I started making those monthly payments religiously. $3,200 every month, never missing a payment, never being late. I moved back home to save on rent, giving up my independence at 23 to help my family. Jennifer continued living there too when she graduated 6 months later, but she wasn't asked to contribute anything. Mom said it would be unfair to burden her with the family's financial problems since she was just starting her career in marketing at a local advertising agency making $38,000 a year. For the first 2 years, everything seemed fine. Dad's business slowly recovered, and he started contributing about $800 a month toward the house payments. But I was still covering the majority of the costs, plus I'd also taken over paying for major repairs and maintenance. When the roof needed replacing after a storm, I paid the $12,000 bill. When the heating system died in the middle of winter, another $8,000 came out of my savings. I was building equity in the house and felt secure knowing this was going to be my inheritance. Jennifer found her rhythm too. She got promoted to account coordinator and was making $42,000 a year, but she still wasn't contributing to household expenses. She lived rent-free, didn't pay for utilities, and Mom still cooked all her meals. I started to resent this arrangement, especially when Jennifer would go out every weekend shopping for new clothes and gadgets while I was putting every spare dollar into the house. But whenever I brought it up, Mom would say, "She's still young, Melissa. Let her enjoy life while she can." By the third year, I'd paid off all the back payments and caught up on everything. The house was no longer in danger of foreclosure, and I felt proud of what I'd accomplished. I'd saved my childhood home and secured my own future at the same time. Dad's business was doing better, and he was contributing more, but I was still paying about $2,000 a month while he covered the rest. I'd put in over $120,000 by that point, plus all the repairs and improvements. That's when Jennifer started dating Brandon Mitchell, and everything began to change in ways I never could have anticipated. Brandon Mitchell seemed like a dream catch when Jennifer first brought him home for Sunday dinner. He was a 31-year-old civil engineer making $85,000 a year, drove a brand new BMW, and wore expensive suits that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. He had this confident smile and firm handshake that immediately impressed Dad, and he brought Mom a bouquet of flowers and a bottle of wine that cost more than I usually spend on groceries in a week. Jennifer was glowing with pride as she introduced him, clearly smitten with his success and charm. During that first dinner, Brandon talked about his engineering projects, his 5-year plan to start his own consulting firm, and his investment portfolio. He mentioned owning a condo downtown but said he was looking for something bigger, something with more character and space for a family. He kept complimenting the house, saying things like, "This is exactly the kind of solid, well-built home that appreciates in value over time, and you can't find craftsmanship like this anymore." Dad beamed with pride, talking about how he'd built every cabinet and laid every tile himself. I should have paid more attention to how Brandon's eyes lingered on the crown molding, the hardwood floors, and the spacious layout. I should have noticed how he asked detailed questions about the property taxes, the neighborhood, and the local school district. But at the time, I just thought he was being polite and showing genuine interest in Jennifer's family home. I was actually happy for my sister. She'd struggled with relationships in college, and Brandon seemed stable and committed to building a future with her. Over the next few months, Brandon became a regular presence at family gatherings. He'd show up with expensive gifts, offer to help Dad with projects around the house, and always complimented Mom's cooking. He was charming and generous, and I could see why Jennifer was falling hard for him. But I started noticing subtle changes in how my parents treated me versus how they treated Jennifer and Brandon as a couple. Mom began making comments about how nice it would be for Jennifer to have security and stability. She'd talk about how important it was for young couples to have their own space to grow and build their relationship. Dad started asking Brandon for advice about investments and property values, treating him like the financial expert in the family despite the fact that I'd been managing the mortgage and household finances for 3 years. The real shift happened about 6 months into Jennifer and Brandon's relationship. I came home from work one day to find them in the living room with Dad, looking at home improvement magazines and talking about potential renovations. Brandon was pointing to pictures of kitchen remodels and bathroom upgrades, saying things like, "This would really increase the property value and these improvements would make this place perfect for entertaining." When I asked what they were planning, Jennifer laughed and said they were just dreaming about the future. But something in her tone made me uncomfortable. Dad said Brandon had offered to help design some upgrades that would modernize the house and increase its value. I asked who would pay for these improvements, and there was an awkward silence before Dad said, "We're just exploring options, honey." That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to check the mail the next day before anyone else got home, something I'd been doing regularly since I was responsible for the mortgage payments. What I found made my blood run cold. There was a letter from our bank addressed to George and Linda Henderson only. When I opened it, I discovered that my name had been removed from the mortgage and the deed to the house. According to the paperwork, the bank had processed a request to remove me as a co-borrower. The letter stated that since the loan was now current and the property had sufficient equity, the primary borrowers had requested to resume sole responsibility for the mortgage. There was a legal document attached showing that my parents had signed papers removing me from all ownership of the property. I confronted Dad that evening, waving the papers in front of him and demanding an explanation. He looked genuinely surprised and confused, saying he didn't remember signing anything like that. He claimed it must have been a mistake, some paperwork error from the bank. Mom backed him up, saying they would never do anything to hurt me after everything I'd done for the family. They promised to call the bank first thing Monday morning to straighten everything out. But when I insisted on being present for that phone call, Dad kept making excuses to postpone it. First, he said the bank representative wasn't available. Then he claimed they needed to gather more documentation. After 2 weeks of delays, I called the bank myself and was told that the paperwork had been properly executed and that George Henderson had specifically requested my removal from the loan and deed. When I confronted my parents again, this time with more specific information from the bank, their story started changing. Dad admitted that Brandon had suggested they clean up the ownership structure of the house to make it easier for them to make decisions about improvements and eventual inheritance planning. He said Brandon had recommended a lawyer who specialized in family property law, and they'd followed his advice without fully understanding what they were signing. Mom jumped in to defend the decision, saying they thought it would protect me from liability if anything went wrong with the house payments in the future. She claimed they were trying to help me by removing the financial burden, even though I'd been successfully making those payments for 3 years without any issues. They both insisted that removing me from the paperwork didn't change their promise that the house would be mine someday. Jennifer, who had been suspiciously absent during these confrontations, finally showed up during one of our discussions. She acted shocked and concerned, saying she had no idea Brandon had given Dad advice about the house paperwork. She hugged me and said she was sorry for the confusion, promising that she'd talk to Brandon about being more careful with his suggestions in the future. Her performance was so convincing that I actually felt guilty for suspecting she might be involved in the plan. Against my better judgment, I decided to trust my family. They seemed genuinely sorry for the confusion, and they reiterated their promise that the house would be mine when they passed away. I continued making my monthly payments of $2,000, plus handling all maintenance and repairs. But I started keeping more detailed records of every payment I made, every receipt for improvements, and every conversation about the house ownership. What I didn't realize at the time was that Brandon had been playing a much longer game than I could have imagined, and Jennifer was a willing participant in a plan that would eventually cost me everything I'd worked for. The manipulation began subtly, but it escalated quickly once Brandon felt confident that my parents were under his influence. About 8 months into his relationship with Jennifer, he started spending almost every evening at our house, treating it like his second home. He'd arrive after work with takeout dinner for everyone, help Dad with household projects on weekends, and gradually inserted himself into every family decision. Mom adored him because he always remembered to ask about her day and complimented her decorating choices. Dad respected him because Brandon spoke confidently about investments, property values, and business strategies. During this time, Jennifer announced that she and Brandon were getting serious about their relationship. They started talking openly about marriage, about wanting to start a family within the next 2 years, and about needing a stable place to build their life together. Brandon would often comment about how perfect our house would be for raising children, with its big backyard, quiet neighborhood, and excellent school district. He'd joke about how expensive it was to find houses with this much character and space in good neighborhoods, saying things like, "Places like this are becoming impossible to afford for young couples just starting out." Mom started echoing these sentiments during our private conversations. She'd mention how hard it was for young people to buy homes in the current market, how important it was for families to help their children get established, and how lucky Jennifer was to have found someone as responsible and financially stable as Brandon. She began making subtle suggestions that maybe Jennifer deserved some security after years of watching me get all the attention and resources from the family. This narrative about me receiving preferential treatment was completely false and infuriating. I was the one making the mortgage payments, paying for repairs, and sacrificing my own independence to keep the family home. But somehow, Mom had reframed my financial contributions as me being taken care of by the family. She started saying things like, "You've been able to live here rent-free for 3 years, Melissa. Maybe it's time to think about what Jennifer needs." Dad's attitude shifted too, though in a different way. He started treating me more like a tenant than a daughter and co-owner of the house. He'd ask permission before making changes to the property, but he'd phrase it as if he was being considerate of my contribution rather than acknowledging my ownership stake. He began having private conversations with Brandon about property values, mortgage rates, and long-term financial planning that excluded me entirely. The pressure really intensified when Jennifer and Brandon announced their engagement 6 months later. They'd planned a small ceremony at a local country club, but Brandon suggested they should also think about their living situation after the wedding. During a family dinner celebrating their engagement, he brought up the topic of housing costs and how difficult it would be for newlyweds to afford a mortgage on a house comparable to ours. Jennifer immediately started tearing up, talking about how scary it was to think about starting married life in a tiny apartment when they wanted to start a family right away. She said she'd always dreamed of having her children grow up in the same house where she'd been raised, with the same backyard and neighborhood memories that we'd shared. Mom reached over and squeezed Jennifer's hand, saying she understood how important those childhood roots were for building a strong family foundation. Brandon, playing the role of the concerned fiancé, said he'd been researching the housing market and found that houses similar to ours were selling for between $400,000 and $500,000. He said there was no way they could afford that kind of mortgage payment on their combined salaries, especially if they wanted Jennifer to be able to stay home with babies for the first few years. He suggested that maybe there was a way for the family to help them get established without anyone having to sacrifice too much. That's when Dad made the suggestion that would change everything. He said maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement where Jennifer and Brandon could take over the mortgage payments and eventually inherit the house, while I could use my financial stability to purchase my own place. He framed it as if this would benefit everyone, giving the young couple a chance to build equity while freeing me up to start my own independent life somewhere else. I was stunned by the suggestion and immediately objected, reminding everyone of the promise that had been made to me 3 years earlier. I pointed out that I'd put over $160,000 into the house by that point, not including the improvements and repairs I'd paid for. I explained that I couldn't afford to buy another house because all my savings had gone into this one, and I'd been counting on this being my long-term home and financial security. Jennifer's response was to start crying harder, accusing me of being selfish and not wanting her to be happy. She said she'd never asked for anything from the family before, and she couldn't believe I would stand in the way of her chance to have a stable marriage and home. Brandon put his arm around her and said he understood this was a difficult situation, but he hoped the family could find a way to support Jennifer's dreams without anyone feeling like they were losing out. Mom immediately jumped to Jennifer's defense, saying that Jennifer had always been the more family-oriented daughter and that she deserved to have the chance to create the same kind of loving home environment where we'd grown up. She suggested that maybe I was being too rigid about the earlier agreement, especially since circumstances had changed so much over the past 3 years. She pointed out that I had a stable career and earning potential, while Jennifer was still establishing herself professionally and needed more family support. Dad tried to play peacemaker, saying he wanted both his daughters to be happy and secure. But his suggestions all revolved around finding ways to give Jennifer what she wanted while expecting me to be flexible and understanding about changing the original arrangement. He said families sometimes had to adapt their plans when new opportunities or needs arose, and he hoped I would be willing to consider what was best for everyone involved. The conversation ended with no resolution, but I could feel the family dynamics shifting against me. Over the following weeks, Jennifer and Brandon continued their campaign of emotional manipulation. Jennifer would break down crying whenever the topic of housing came up, talking about how impossible it felt to start a marriage without security. Brandon would make helpful suggestions about apartments I could rent or smaller houses I could afford, always framing it as if he was trying to help me find better options. Mom started bringing up the topic constantly, saying she couldn't bear to see Jennifer so stressed about her future. She'd mention articles she'd read about young couples struggling to buy homes, statistics about how difficult it was for families to get established in expensive housing markets, and stories about other families who had found creative solutions to help their children succeed. Dad would nod along and suggest that maybe we needed to have another family meeting to find a compromise that worked for everyone. I realized that I was being systematically isolated and pressured to give up my rights to the house, but I had no idea how sophisticated and far-reaching their plan actually was. Brandon wasn't just manipulating my family's emotions, he was also working behind the scenes to ensure that I would have no legal recourse when they finally revealed their true intentions. The engagement period dragged on for another 6 months while the pressure campaign intensified. Jennifer and Brandon set their wedding date for September, which they said would give them time to figure out their living situation and plan the perfect celebration. During this time, the manipulation became more systematic and cruel. Brandon had essentially moved into our house, staying over 4 or 5 nights a week and treating me like an unwelcome guest in what was supposed to be my own home. He'd criticize my housekeeping, suggest that I was taking up too much space with my belongings, and make passive-aggressive comments about how much easier it would be for Jennifer to maintain the house once they were married. Jennifer started acting like she was already the lady of the house, rearranging furniture, redecorating rooms, and making plans for changes they wanted to implement after the wedding. She'd talk constantly about her vision for their future family life in their home, never acknowledging that I had any claim to the space. Mom and Dad enabled this behavior completely. They'd praise Jennifer's decorating ideas, encourage her wedding planning discussions, and treat Brandon like the son they'd always wanted. Meanwhile, they started treating me like a burden who was standing in the way of Jennifer's happiness. Mom would make comments about how I needed to move on with my life and stop holding on to the past. Dad would suggest that I should be happy for my sister instead of focusing on my own needs all the time. The breaking point came 3 months before the wedding, during what Dad called an important family meeting. He asked me to take the afternoon off work so we could all sit down together and make some final decisions about the house situation. I agreed, thinking this might finally be the chance to establish clear boundaries and resolve the ownership question once and for all. I arrived home to find Brandon, Jennifer, Mom, and Dad sitting around the kitchen table with a folder full of legal documents. Dad cleared his throat and announced that they had made a decision about the house. He said they'd consulted with a lawyer and determined the best way to handle the situation for everyone involved. Then he dropped the bomb that destroyed my trust in my family forever. He said they had decided to give the house to Jennifer and Brandon as a wedding gift. The deed would be transferred to them free and clear, allowing them to start their marriage with the security and stability they needed to build their family. He explained that this decision was made because Jennifer was the daughter who wanted to continue the family traditions and values that the house represented, while I had always been more independent and career-focused. When I started to protest, bringing up the hundreds of thousands of dollars I'd invested in the house, Mom cut me off with a cold response that I'll never forget. She said that the money I'd paid over the years was simply rent for living in the house, and that I'd been foolish to think of it as anything else. She claimed that I'd been living there essentially for free because rent on a comparable house would have been much more expensive, and that the family had been generous to let me stay there as long as they had. I was speechless with shock and rage. The rewriting of history was so complete and shameless that I couldn't even process what was happening at first. These were the same people who had begged me to help save their house, who had promised me ownership in exchange for my sacrifice, who had watched me pour my life savings into their mortgage payments and home improvements. Now they were acting like I'd been a privileged tenant who should be grateful for their generosity. Jennifer's reaction was the most devastating of all. Instead of acknowledging the sacrifice I'd made or showing any guilt about benefiting from my financial loss, she started crying and accusing me of trying to ruin her happiness. She said I'd always been jealous of her relationships and that I couldn't stand to see her succeed in love when my own romantic life was struggling. She claimed that I was being vindictive and cruel, trying to destroy her wedding and marriage before they even began. Brandon played his role perfectly, acting like the reasonable mediator trying to keep peace in the family. He said he understood that this was a difficult situation for everyone, but he hoped we could find a way to move forward without destroying family relationships. He suggested that maybe there was some way to compensate me for my contributions, though he made it clear that he considered my claims to ownership to be unrealistic and legally questionable. Dad tried to soften the blow by saying this decision was actually better for me in the long run. He claimed that being tied to the family house was holding me back from pursuing my own dreams and independence. He said they were freeing me up to make my own choices about where to live and how to invest my money going forward. He even suggested that this might be the push I needed to finally get married and start my own family somewhere else. When I demanded to see the legal documents they'd prepared, Dad hesitated but finally handed over the folder. Inside were papers transferring full ownership of the house from George and Linda Henderson to Jennifer Henderson and Brandon Mitchell, effective immediately after their wedding ceremony. There were also documents showing that the mortgage had been refinanced in Jennifer and Brandon's names, though I later learned that this was only possible because of the equity I'd built up through my payments. The most insulting part was a single sheet of paper at the bottom of the pile, titled Family Loan Acknowledgement. It stated that Melissa Henderson had received housing valued at approximately $150,000 over 3 years in exchange for her contributions to household expenses. It basically documented their claim that I'd been a paying tenant rather than a co-owner, and it released them from any obligation to compensate me for my actual financial investment. I told them this was theft, plain and simple, and that I would not stand for being robbed by my own family. I reminded them of Dad's specific promise that the house would be mine, of Mom's gratitude when I'd saved them from foreclosure, of all the sacrifices I'd made to keep their dream alive. But they'd already made up their minds, and my protests were treated like the unreasonable demands of a spoiled child. The meeting ended with me storming out of the house, clutching copies of the legal documents and trying to figure out what options I had left. For the first time in my life, I truly understood what betrayal felt like. The people who had raised me, who I'd loved and trusted and sacrificed for, had conspired to steal everything I'd worked for and then convinced themselves that they were the victims of my selfishness. That night, I called my best friend Diana Miller, who I'd known since nursing school. Diana had always been skeptical of my family's financial arrangement, warning me that mixing money with family relationships was dangerous. When I told her what had happened, she was furious but not surprised. She said she'd suspected something like this was coming based on the way my parents had started talking about Jennifer and Brandon's relationship. Diana helped me research family law attorneys in our area, and by the end of the week, I had a consultation scheduled with Rebecca Torres, a lawyer who specialized in property disputes and family financial conflicts. Rebecca listened to my story, reviewed the documents I'd brought, and told me that I definitely had grounds for a legal challenge. The promises that had been made to me, combined with the financial contributions I could document, created what she called a constructive trust that gave me legitimate ownership claims. But Rebecca also warned me that fighting my own family in court would be expensive, emotionally devastating, and potentially unsuccessful if they were willing to lie under oath about their original promises to me. She said family property disputes were some of the most bitter and destructive cases she handled, often ending with relationships that could never be repaired. She asked if I was prepared for the possibility that pursuing legal action might mean losing my family forever. I thought about that question for several days, weighing the financial loss against the emotional cost of a legal battle. But ultimately, I realized that my family had already chosen to destroy our relationship by betraying and stealing from me. They'd made it clear that they valued Jennifer's happiness and Brandon's approval more than honesty, fairness, or keeping their word to me. I had nothing left to lose except my self-respect, and I wasn't willing to give that up without a fight. 2 weeks before Jennifer's wedding, I filed a lawsuit challenging the transfer of the house and demanding compensation for my financial contributions. The legal papers were served to my parents and Jennifer on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, the family war had officially begun. Filing the lawsuit felt like jumping off a cliff, but I knew it was my only chance to recover what I'd lost and hold my family accountable for their betrayal. Rebecca Torres had prepared a comprehensive case documenting my financial contributions to the house, the promises that had been made to me, and the deliberate deception that had led to my name being removed from the deed without my knowledge or consent. She said we had strong evidence for several legal claims, including breach of contract, unjust enrichment, and fraudulent transfer of property. The first challenge was gathering all the documentation we needed to prove my case. I spent weeks digging through bank statements, canceled checks, and receipts for every payment I'd made toward the house over the past 3 years. Rebecca's paralegal helped me create a detailed spreadsheet showing that I'd contributed over $180,000 in mortgage payments, plus another $35,000 in repairs, improvements, and maintenance. We also collected testimony from neighbors who had heard my parents talk about the house being my inheritance, and from my supervisor at the hospital who knew about my financial arrangement with my family. Rebecca explained that the key to our case was proving that my contributions went far beyond what a tenant would pay in rent, and that my family had intentionally created the impression that I was building equity in the property. The fact that I'd been added as a co-borrower on the original loan modification showed that I wasn't just a renter, and the subsequent removal of my name without proper notice could be considered fraudulent depending on the circumstances. While we were building our case, Jennifer and Brandon were moving forward with their wedding plans as if nothing had happened. They sent out invitations with their new address listed as the family house, registered for expensive gifts for their new home, and posted photos on social media showing off their engagement pictures taken in the backyard that I'd helped pay to maintain. The casual way they were already claiming ownership of the property, even before their wedding, made my blood boil every time I saw it. My parents' response to the lawsuit was swift and brutal. Instead of trying to negotiate or acknowledge any wrongdoing, they immediately hired Harold Bennett, one of the most expensive family law attorneys in the state. Harold had a reputation for taking scorched-earth approaches to property disputes, and his retainer fee alone was probably more than I made in 6 months. The fact that my parents were willing to spend that kind of money to fight me showed just how committed they were to stealing my inheritance and giving it to Jennifer. Harold's strategy became clear within the first few weeks of the legal proceedings. Instead of disputing the amount of money I'd contributed to the house, he focused on recharacterizing the nature of those contributions. His court filings claimed that I had been a gratuitous tenant who had volunteered to help with household expenses out of the goodness of my heart, with no expectation of ownership or compensation. He argued that my parents had provided me with free housing, utilities, and meals for 3 years, and that the value of those benefits exceeded my monetary contributions. The legal papers filed by Harold's office painted me as an ungrateful daughter who was trying to extort money from elderly parents who had generously allowed me to live in their home. They claimed that I'd never been promised ownership of the house, that the addition of my name to the mortgage was a temporary arrangement to help with loan approval, and that my removal from the deed was always planned once the mortgage was stabilized. According to their version of events, I was now trying to take advantage of my parents' generosity and destroy my sister's wedding out of jealousy and greed. Reading those legal documents was like being punched in the stomach repeatedly. Not only were my parents willing to steal from me, they were now willing to lie under oath and destroy my reputation to cover up their theft. They were portraying themselves as victims of my manipulation while simultaneously using expensive lawyers to ensure that their lies would be presented as convincingly as possible in court. The emotional warfare escalated quickly once the legal battle became public knowledge in our small community. Jennifer immediately launched a campaign to turn our extended family and mutual friends against me. She called our aunts, uncles, and cousins to tell them her version of events, portraying me as a vindictive sister who was trying to ruin her wedding and steal her parents' house. She created a narrative where she was the innocent victim of my jealousy and greed, and where my parents were being unfairly attacked by their own daughter. Brandon used his professional network and social connections to spread rumors about my mental health and financial stability. He suggested to anyone who would listen that I was having some kind of breakdown, that I'd become obsessed with money and property, and that my family was worried about my psychological state. He positioned himself as the reasonable voice trying to help resolve a family crisis created by my unrealistic expectations and emotional instability. The character assassination campaign was remarkably effective. Within a month of filing the lawsuit, I found myself completely isolated from most of my extended family and many of our mutual friends. People who had known me for years started treating me like I'd committed some terrible crime against my innocent parents and sister. I received angry phone calls from relatives telling me I should be ashamed of myself for putting Jennifer's wedding at risk and causing my parents so much stress and legal expense. Mom and Dad played their roles perfectly in this drama. They presented themselves as heartbroken parents who couldn't understand how their daughter had become so selfish and vindictive. Mom would cry whenever anyone asked about the situation, talking about how devastating it was to be sued by your own child and how worried she was about my mental health. Dad would shake his head sadly and say he'd tried to be patient with me, but that I'd crossed a line by bringing lawyers into a family matter. The stress of fighting my own family while being portrayed as the villain in my own community began taking a serious toll on my physical and mental health. I was working 12-hour shifts at the hospital while spending my evenings and weekends with Rebecca preparing for court hearings and depositions. I'd lost about 15 pounds because I was too anxious to eat regularly, and I was having trouble sleeping because my mind would race with worry about the lawsuit and my fractured family relationships. My friend Diana became my lifeline during this period, providing emotional support and helping me stay focused on the facts of the case rather than getting overwhelmed by the emotional manipulation. She reminded me constantly that I was fighting for justice and financial survival, not just family drama, and that giving up would mean letting my family get away with stealing over $200,000 from me. The breakthrough in our case came when Rebecca hired a private investigator named Mark Stevens to look more deeply into Brandon's background and his role in manipulating my family's decision-making. Mark had experience with financial fraud cases, and Rebecca thought there might be more to Brandon's involvement than just giving bad advice about property law. She suspected that someone with his financial sophistication would have understood the legal implications of removing my name from the deed, and she wanted to explore whether there had been intentional fraud rather than just family favoritism. Mark's initial investigation revealed some concerning information about Brandon's past relationships and financial dealings, but we were still gathering evidence when the most devastating blow of the legal battle landed. Harold Bennett filed a motion requesting that the court order me to pay my parents' legal fees if I lost the case, claiming that my lawsuit was frivolous and designed to harass elderly parents who were just trying to help their younger daughter get married. The possibility of owing hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees on top of losing my investment in the house made this legal battle a terrifying gamble with my entire financial future. But I'd already come too far to turn back, and I knew that my family was counting on exactly this kind of pressure to force me to give up my claims and disappear quietly from their lives. The pressure campaign reached new levels of cruelty as my family realized that I wasn't going to back down from the legal fight despite their character assassination efforts. Jennifer, who had always been dramatic but never particularly strategic, revealed a talent for manipulation that shocked me with its sophistication and malice. 2 months before her wedding, she announced that she'd been diagnosed with a serious anxiety disorder that was being triggered by the stress of my lawsuit. Jennifer's medical condition became the centerpiece of a new emotional manipulation campaign designed to make me look like a monster who was literally making her sick with my legal demands. She started missing work frequently, claiming that panic attacks and stress-induced migraines were making it impossible for her to function normally. She made sure that everyone in our family and social circle knew that her health problems were directly caused by my selfish decision to sue the family during her wedding preparation time. Mom and Dad coordinated this health crisis narrative perfectly with their own victim storylines. Mom started telling people that she was seeing a therapist because the stress of being sued by her own daughter was causing her to have depression and insomnia. Dad claimed that his blood pressure had become dangerously high because of the family conflict, and that his doctor had warned him about the health risks of ongoing legal stress at his age. They positioned themselves as elderly parents whose health was being endangered by their vindictive daughter's greed. The most devious part of this strategy was how they used Jennifer's fragile mental health to justify making decisions about the house without consulting me or waiting for the lawsuit to be resolved. They claimed that Jennifer needed stability and security for her recovery, and that the uncertainty created by my legal challenge was preventing her from getting the treatment she needed. They started talking about how important it was for her to have a safe space to heal and how the family home represented emotional security for her during this difficult time. Brandon played his role as the concerned fiancé perfectly, expressing worry about Jennifer's health while subtly blaming me for causing her suffering. He would make comments about how difficult it was to plan a wedding when Jennifer was dealing with stress-induced illness, and how he was considering postponing their marriage until the family situation was resolved. This created additional pressure on me from relatives who were worried that I was not only ruining Jennifer's wedding but also potentially destroying her relationship with the man she loved. The manipulation became even more sophisticated when Harold Bennett used Jennifer's health issues as part of their legal strategy. He filed court documents claiming that my lawsuit was causing documented medical harm to Jennifer and my parents, and he requested expedited hearings so that the property transfer could be completed quickly to reduce the family's stress and protect Jennifer's mental health during her wedding preparation. During this same period, Mark Stevens' investigation into Brandon's background began revealing disturbing information that explained his sophisticated approach to manipulating my family. Mark discovered that Brandon had been involved in a similar property scheme 3 years earlier with his previous girlfriend's family. In that case, he had convinced a widow to add his girlfriend's name to her house deed, supposedly to help with estate planning, and then encouraged the girlfriend to pressure her mother into gifting them the house as a wedding present. The earlier scheme had been successful, resulting in Brandon and his ex-girlfriend receiving a house worth over $300,000 that the girlfriend's mother had owned free and clear. The relationship had ended shortly after the property transfer was completed, leaving the mother with no legal recourse and no way to recover her home. Mark found court records showing that the mother had tried to challenge the transfer, but had been unsuccessful because she couldn't prove that Brandon had deliberately manipulated the situation. Even more shocking was Mark's discovery that Brandon had researched my family's financial situation extensively before beginning his relationship with Jennifer. Through social media analysis and public records research, Mark found evidence that Brandon had known about my mortgage payments and the family's property ownership structure before he ever met Jennifer. This suggested that his relationship with my sister might have been motivated by financial opportunity rather than genuine romance. Rebecca was thrilled with Mark's findings because they provided evidence of intentional fraud that could strengthen our legal case significantly. If we could prove that Brandon had deliberately targeted Jennifer because of her family's property situation, and that he had manipulated my parents into transferring ownership of the house through deception and false promises, we might be able to have the entire transfer declared fraudulent and void. But Mark's investigation also revealed how much danger I was in from people who were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to steal my property and destroy my reputation. Brandon wasn't just an opportunistic boyfriend who had given bad advice to my family. He was someone who had a pattern of targeting families with valuable assets, manipulating their emotional dynamics, and walking away with property that didn't belong to him. The most frightening discovery was that Brandon had been researching my personal life, work schedule, and financial situation in ways that went far beyond normal boyfriend behavior. Mark found evidence that Brandon had been monitoring my social media accounts, researching my coworkers and friends, and even tracking my daily routines. This suggested that he saw me as an obstacle to be neutralized rather than just a sister who needed to be convinced to give up her claims to the family house. While Mark was uncovering evidence of Brandon's predatory behavior, my family was escalating their psychological warfare to new levels. Mom started calling my workplace, claiming to be worried about my mental health and asking my supervisors to watch for signs that I was having a breakdown. She told them that I'd been acting erratically at home, making threats against family members, and obsessing about money in ways that concerned her about my psychological stability. Dad contacted several of my longtime friends, telling them that he was worried I was having some kind of mental health crisis and asking them to encourage me to drop the lawsuit and seek professional help. He painted a picture of me as someone who had become delusional about my financial contributions to the house, and who was now lashing out at family members because I couldn't accept reality. Jennifer's contribution to this campaign was to start posting on social media about the importance of supporting family members who were struggling with mental health issues. She shared articles about anxiety disorders, depression, and family conflicts while making vague references to a family member who was going through a difficult time. Anyone who knew about our legal battle would understand that she was talking about me, and her posts created the impression that she was the caring sister trying to help her unstable sibling. The coordinated nature of these attacks on my reputation and mental health convinced Rebecca that we were dealing with people who had planned this property theft far in advance and were now working systematically to destroy my credibility and force me to abandon my legal challenge. She said she'd rarely seen such sophisticated manipulation in family property disputes, and that the level of coordination between Jennifer, Brandon, and my parents suggested they'd been planning this betrayal for much longer than I realized. As we prepared for the next phase of the legal battle, Rebecca warned me that things were going to get worse before they got better. She said people who were willing to go to these lengths to steal property and destroy family relationships wouldn't hesitate to escalate their tactics if they felt their plan was in jeopardy. She advised me to document everything, limit my contact with family members, and be prepared for them to make even more serious accusations against me as the court date approached. I felt like I was living in a nightmare where the people who had raised me had turned into strangers who would do anything to destroy me. But Mark's investigation had also given me hope that the truth about Brandon's manipulation and my family's betrayal might finally come to light in a way that would be impossible for them to deny or reframe. Mark Stevens' investigation reached a crucial breakthrough when he uncovered financial records that revealed the true scope of Brandon's manipulation and my family's deception. Working with a forensic accountant, Mark traced money transfers and loan applications that showed Brandon had been planning this property theft for over 2 years, using Jennifer as his unwitting accomplice while systematically isolating me from my own family's decision-making process. The most damning evidence came from Brandon's email account, which Mark had gained access to through entirely legal means during his investigation. The emails revealed a calculated campaign to manipulate my parents' emotions and exploit their desire to help Jennifer while gradually convincing them that I was a burden who needed to be removed from the family property situation. Brandon had researched property law extensively, consulted with multiple attorneys about the best strategies for transferring ownership, and even practiced different emotional appeals he could use to convince my parents to betray their promises to me. One particularly shocking email thread showed Brandon discussing his plans with a friend who had apparently helped him with his previous property scheme. In these messages, Brandon referred to me as the obstacle and described his strategy for using Jennifer's relationship with our parents to gradually turn them against me. He wrote about identifying my parents' emotional triggers, exploiting their fears about financial security, and creating situations where they would view me as selfish for not supporting Jennifer's marriage. The emails also revealed that Jennifer was not the innocent victim I had initially believed her to be. While she may not have understood the full scope of Brandon's manipulation at the beginning of their relationship, she had become a willing participant in the scheme once she realized the financial benefits she could gain. Email exchanges between Jennifer and Brandon showed them discussing how to pressure my parents, coordinating their emotional manipulation tactics, and celebrating each step forward in their campaign to steal the house. Most devastatingly, the emails proved that my parents had been lying when they claimed the property transfer was a spontaneous decision made to help Jennifer's wedding preparations. Brandon and Jennifer had been working on this plan for over 18 months, gradually convincing my parents that I was taking advantage of them financially and that Jennifer deserved to inherit the house instead of me. They had even discussed the best timing for removing my name from the deed, choosing a moment when I would be too busy with work to notice the paperwork immediately. Rebecca was ecstatic about these discoveries because they provided clear evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and intentional deception that would be very difficult for Harold Bennett to explain away in court. The emails showed premeditation, coordination between multiple parties, and deliberate steps taken to conceal the conspiracy from me until it was too late for me to prevent the property transfer. But Mark's investigation also revealed how much personal danger I had been in without realizing it. Brandon's research into my life had included detailed information about my work schedule, my daily routines, and my financial accounts. He had even researched my medical history and personal relationships in ways that suggested he was looking for vulnerabilities he could exploit if I became too difficult to handle through manipulation alone. More frightening was Mark's discovery that Brandon had consulted with private investigators about having me followed and potentially setting me up for legal problems that would discredit me as a witness in any property dispute. While there was no evidence that he had actually implemented these plans, the fact that he had researched these options showed how far he was willing to go to protect his scheme from being exposed. Armed with this new evidence, Rebecca filed an emergency motion with the court requesting an immediate freeze on any further property transfers and asking for expedited hearings to address the fraudulent nature of the deed changes. She argued that my family was attempting to complete a criminal conspiracy to steal my property, and that allowing the wedding and property transfer to proceed would make it much more difficult to recover my investment and hold the conspirators accountable. The motion also requested that the court order Brandon to preserve all electronic communications and financial records related to his relationship with Jennifer and his involvement in family property decisions. Rebecca wanted to ensure that no additional evidence would be destroyed before we had a chance to present our case to a judge. Harold Bennett's response to our motion was swift and predictable. He claimed that the emails Mark had discovered were taken out of context, that Brandon's research into property law was simply due diligence for someone planning to marry into a family with complex financial arrangements, and that any discussions about property transfers were normal conversations between people planning a marriage and thinking about their future housing needs. More seriously, Harold filed a counter-motion claiming that Mark's investigation had involved illegal surveillance and violation of privacy rights. He demanded that all evidence gathered by Mark be excluded from the court proceedings, and he requested sanctions against me and Rebecca for allegedly engaging in unethical investigation tactics. This was clearly a desperate attempt to prevent the damaging evidence from being presented to the judge, but it also showed how worried my family had become about the strength of our case. The most encouraging development was that Mark had also identified a witness who could corroborate my version of events about the original promises my parents had made to me. Tom Parker was a contractor who had worked on several projects at the family house over the years, and he had overheard multiple conversations between my parents and me about the property ownership arrangement. Tom remembered my parents specifically telling him that I was investing in my inheritance and that the house would belong to me when they passed away. Tom had initially been reluctant to get involved in family legal disputes, but Mark's investigation had revealed that Brandon had actually tried to pressure Tom into changing his testimony about what he'd heard. Brandon had approached Tom claiming to represent the family's interests and asking him to remember conversations differently if anyone ever asked him about property ownership discussions. This attempted witness tampering had backfired badly, convincing Tom that something very wrong was happening and motivating him to come forward with the truth. Rebecca scheduled Tom's deposition for the following week, and she was confident that his testimony would provide independent confirmation of my parents' original promises about the house inheritance. Combined with Mark's evidence about Brandon's manipulation campaign and Jennifer's participation in the scheme, Tom's testimony would create a compelling case that I had been systematically defrauded by my own family. As we prepared for the crucial court hearing, Diana helped me understand that we were finally approaching the moment when the truth would be revealed and justice might be served. But she also warned me that my family would probably escalate their attacks on my credibility and reputation as they realized how much trouble they were in legally. She was right about that warning, but none of us anticipated just how desperately and viciously they would fight when their conspiracy finally began falling apart. The night before Tom Parker's deposition, I received a phone call that would change everything. It was Jennifer, crying hysterically and begging me to drop the lawsuit before it was too late. She said she'd made terrible mistakes and that she was scared about what Brandon might do if the truth came out about his past. For the first time since this nightmare began, I heard something in my sister's voice that sounded like the person I used to know before Brandon came into our lives. But when I asked her to tell the truth about what had really happened and to help me recover my stolen property, Jennifer's moment of honesty disappeared as quickly as it had come. She said she couldn't betray Brandon or hurt our parents by admitting to the conspiracy, and that she hoped I would understand that family loyalty had to come before money and legal technicalities. Then she hung up, leaving me to wonder if that brief glimpse of remorse had been genuine or just another manipulation tactic designed to make me lower my guard before the final battle. The wedding day arrived with all the fanfare and celebration that Jennifer had dreamed about, but also with process servers, lawyers, and law enforcement officers who were there to ensure that justice would finally be served. Rebecca had coordinated with the local police and court officials to have arrest warrants prepared for Brandon based on the evidence of fraud and conspiracy that Mark's investigation had uncovered. She had also arranged for the wedding ceremony to be interrupted with legal documents that would prevent the property transfer from being completed and expose the criminal conspiracy to all the guests who had been unknowingly celebrating stolen property. I arrived at the country club venue with Rebecca, Mark Stevens, Tom Parker, and Detective Sarah Collins, who had been assigned to handle the fraud case once Rebecca presented the evidence to the district attorney's office. We waited until the ceremony was halfway complete, giving Jennifer and Brandon enough time to exchange vows but interrupting before the final pronouncement that would legally bind them in marriage and potentially complicate the property recovery process. The moment when I walked into that wedding reception with law enforcement officials was both terrifying and liberating. I saw the shocked faces of relatives and family friends who had believed my family's lies about my mental health and greed, watched my parents' confident smiles turn to panic as they realized their scheme was about to be exposed publicly, and felt a mixture of sadness and satisfaction as Jennifer's perfect wedding day crumbled around her. Rebecca addressed the assembled guests with calm professionalism, explaining that legal proceedings were taking place related to property fraud and that some of the wedding celebrants were under investigation for criminal conspiracy. She announced that the property being given as a wedding gift had actually been stolen from me through deliberate deception and manipulation, and that evidence of this fraud would be presented in court within the coming weeks. Detective Collins then read the charges against Brandon, which included wire fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and attempted witness tampering. The evidence that Mark had gathered was overwhelming enough to justify immediate arrest, and Brandon's attempts to deny involvement were undermined by his own emails and financial records that documented his systematic campaign to steal my property. The most dramatic moment came when Tom Parker took the microphone and addressed the wedding guests directly. He explained how he had witnessed my parents promise me ownership of the house in exchange for my financial contributions, how Brandon had approached him to try to change his testimony about those conversations, and how he had realized that an innocent family was being victimized by a sophisticated con artist who had manipulated their emotions and relationships for financial gain. As Tom spoke, I watched Jennifer's face transform from confusion to horror to devastating understanding. She finally realized that Brandon had used her love and her relationship with our parents as tools in a criminal scheme, and that her dream wedding was actually the celebration of a successful property theft. Her reaction was heartbreaking even though she had participated in betraying me, because I could see the moment when she understood how completely she had been manipulated and exploited. Brandon's response to being exposed was to try to shift all blame onto Jennifer and my parents. He claimed that he had simply offered advice about property law when asked, and that any decisions about transferring ownership of the house had been made by my family without his input or encouragement. He portrayed himself as an innocent boyfriend who had been caught up in a family dispute that had nothing to do with him. But Mark Stevens had prepared for exactly this defense strategy. He presented copies of Brandon's emails that showed him researching my family's financial situation before he met Jennifer, planning the emotional manipulation campaign in detail, and celebrating each successful step in convincing my parents to betray their promises to me. The evidence made it impossible for Brandon to claim ignorance or lack of involvement in the conspiracy. The revelation of Brandon's criminal history was equally devastating to his defense. Mark had discovered that Brandon's previous property scheme had been part of a pattern of targeting vulnerable families with valuable assets, using romantic relationships to gain access to family decision-making processes, and walking away with property that legally belonged to other people. The prosecutor explained that Brandon was what law enforcement called a romance scammer who specialized in long-term financial fraud through intimate relationships. My parents' reaction to these revelations was a mixture of shock, denial, and desperate attempts to minimize their own responsibility for what had happened. Dad tried to claim that he had been protecting the family from a difficult situation and that he had never intended to hurt me financially. Mom insisted that she had been trying to help both of her daughters and that she couldn't have known that Brandon was manipulating everyone's emotions for criminal purposes. But Rebecca had prepared for their denials as well. She presented evidence showing that my parents had consulted with multiple attorneys about the best ways to remove me from the property ownership, had deliberately concealed the legal changes from me until after they were completed, and had participated in the character assassination campaign designed to discredit me and force me to abandon my legal challenge. While they might have been initially manipulated by Brandon, they had become willing participants in the conspiracy once they understood the financial benefits they could gain. The most painful part of the confrontation was watching Jennifer finally understand how much damage had been done to our family relationships and her own future. She realized that her marriage was based on lies and criminal activity, that her parents had chosen money over honesty and family loyalty, and that her dream of starting a family in our childhood home was actually the result of theft and betrayal. Her breakdown was complete and devastating, and despite everything she had done to hurt me, I felt sorry for how thoroughly she had been used and manipulated. The legal resolution came swiftly once all the evidence was presented publicly. The court issued an immediate restraining order preventing any further property transfers, froze the assets that Brandon and Jennifer had planned to use for their honeymoon and new life together, and ordered the house deed to be returned to my name pending the resolution of the criminal proceedings. The wedding reception ended with arrests, lawyers, and devastated family members trying to understand how their celebration had turned into a crime scene. Within a week, Brandon had been indicted on multiple felony charges and was facing prison time that could extend for several years. Jennifer's role in the conspiracy was being investigated by the prosecutor's office, though her status as one of Brandon's victims complicated the question of whether she would face criminal charges herself. My parents were required to cooperate with the investigation and faced potential civil liability for their participation in the property fraud, though their ages and the manipulation they had suffered from Brandon made prosecution less likely. The most satisfying aspect of the resolution was that everyone who had believed my family's lies about my mental health and greed now understood the truth about what had really happened. The wedding guests who had witnessed the dramatic exposure of the conspiracy spread the story throughout our community, and within days everyone knew that I had been the victim of an elaborate fraud rather than a vindictive daughter trying to steal her parents' house. But the victory came with enormous emotional costs that would take years to fully understand and process. My relationship with my parents was permanently destroyed by their betrayal and their willingness to participate in character assassination to cover up their theft. Jennifer's marriage was annulled before it had even been legally finalized, and her relationship with our parents was severely damaged by their willingness to use her emotions and desires as tools in Brandon's criminal scheme. The house that had caused so much conflict and pain was legally mine again, but it no longer felt like home or represented the security and inheritance I had worked so hard to preserve. Too much damage had been done, too many lies had been told, and too much trust had been broken for me to ever feel comfortable living there again. 6 months after Brandon's conviction and sentencing to 3 years in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy, I made the decision that would finally allow me to move forward with my life. I put the family house on the market and sold it for $432,000, which was almost exactly what I had invested in the property over the 5 years of mortgage payments, repairs, and improvements. The sale meant that I recovered my financial investment and could start over somewhere new, free from the painful memories and broken promises that had made the house feel like a monument to betrayal rather than a family home. The legal proceedings had taken an enormous emotional and financial toll on everyone involved, but the truth had finally been revealed in ways that no one could deny or reframe. Harold Bennett's expensive legal defense had crumbled once Mark Stevens' evidence was presented to the court, and my parents were forced to pay substantial legal fees and court costs as part of their settlement agreement. Jennifer avoided criminal prosecution in exchange for her cooperation with the federal investigators, but she lost her job due to the publicity surrounding the case and struggled to rebuild her reputation and career. My parents' relationship with each other and with both of their daughters was permanently damaged by their participation in Brandon's scheme. Dad's construction business suffered severe losses when news of the fraud conviction became public, and several longtime clients canceled contracts because they no longer trusted his integrity. Mom's depression and anxiety, which had begun as manipulation tactics to pressure me into dropping my lawsuit, became genuine mental health issues as she struggled to process the guilt and consequences of her choices. The house sale gave me the freedom to make a completely fresh start in a new city where no one knew about my family's betrayal or the legal battle that had consumed 2 years of my life. I moved to Portland, Oregon, where I found a position as a nurse practitioner at a community health clinic serving underserved populations. The work was challenging and meaningful, focusing on helping people who had been failed by other institutions and systems, which felt appropriate given my own experience with betrayal and injustice. Diana, my best friend who had supported me throughout the legal battle, helped me find a beautiful one-bedroom apartment in a historic neighborhood near the clinic where I worked. For the first time in years, I was living completely independently, paying my own rent and utilities without having to worry about supporting anyone else's financial needs or dreams. The apartment was small but comfortable, with big windows that let in natural light and a view of mountains that reminded me every morning that I had successfully escaped the nightmare of my family's manipulation. Tom Parker, the contractor whose testimony had been crucial to exposing Brandon's scheme, had become much more than a helpful witness during the legal proceedings. His integrity and courage in standing up to Brandon's intimidation tactics had impressed me, and his genuine concern for my welfare during the most difficult period of my life had grown into something deeper than friendship. When I decided to move to Portland, Tom chose to relocate his construction business there as well, saying he wanted to be part of building something new rather than just repairing things that had been broken. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, built on mutual respect and shared experiences of standing up for truth and justice when it would have been easier to look the other way. Tom understood the trust issues I was dealing with after being betrayed by my own family, and he was patient with my need to take things slowly and be absolutely certain about people's motivations and character before letting them become important in my life. The community health clinic where I worked became my new family in many ways, providing the sense of purpose and belonging that had been destroyed by my biological family's betrayal. My colleagues were dedicated professionals who had chosen careers focused on helping vulnerable populations rather than maximizing their own financial gain. Working with patients who had been abandoned by their families, exploited by employers, or failed by government systems helped me understand that my experience, while devastating, was part of a larger pattern of powerful people taking advantage of those who trusted them. I started volunteering with a legal aid organization that helped low-income families fight property fraud and elder financial abuse. My experience with Brandon's manipulation tactics and the sophisticated legal strategies used to steal family property made me a valuable advocate for other victims of similar schemes. Rebecca Torres, who had become a friend as well as my attorney, referred several cases to the legal aid clinic where I could help families understand their rights and navigate the legal system. The volunteer work was therapeutic for me because it transformed my painful experience into something useful for helping other people protect themselves and recover from similar betrayals. I discovered that romance scams and family property fraud were much more common than most people realized, and that many victims never recovered their losses because they didn't understand their legal options or couldn't afford the kind of legal representation that had been essential to my case. About a year after moving to Portland, I received a letter from Jennifer that marked the first communication between us since the wedding day confrontation. She had been through extensive therapy to process her role in Brandon's manipulation and the damage that had been done to our family relationships. Her letter was a genuine apology that acknowledged the pain she had caused me and took responsibility for her choices, even while explaining how thoroughly she had been deceived and exploited by Brandon. Jennifer's letter helped me understand that forgiveness was possible even when trust could never be fully restored. I wrote back to her, explaining that I appreciated her apology and hoped she could rebuild her life in honest and healthy ways, but that I wasn't ready for an ongoing relationship given the depth of betrayal and manipulation that had occurred. The correspondence helped both of us find some closure and peace, even though we would probably never be close sisters again. My parents' attempts at reconciliation were less successful, mainly because they continued to minimize their role in the conspiracy and focus on their own victimization by Brandon rather than acknowledging the ways they had betrayed and hurt me. Dad's letters focused on his business losses and health problems, asking for my understanding and forgiveness without clearly accepting responsibility for his choices. Mom's messages were emotional appeals about family reconciliation that ignored the fundamental trust issues that had been created by their deliberate deception and character assassination. The distance from my biological family was painful, but it was also liberating in ways I hadn't expected. I realized that the obligation to maintain family relationships regardless of how those people treated me had been a source of stress and limitation throughout my adult life. Being free from those toxic dynamics allowed me to choose relationships based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care rather than biological accidents and social expectations. Tom and I got engaged on the second anniversary of the day we met, during Tom Parker's testimony that had helped expose the truth about Brandon's conspiracy. Our relationship was built on trust, honesty, and shared experiences of standing up for justice when it was difficult and costly to do so. The engagement ring was simple but beautiful, and Tom had saved the money to buy it through his own hard work rather than inheriting it or stealing it from someone else. Planning our wedding was a completely different experience from watching Jennifer's elaborate celebration of stolen property and criminal conspiracy. We focused on creating a celebration that reflected our values and included people who genuinely cared about our happiness and success. The guest list was small but meaningful, including Diana, Rebecca Torres, Mark Stevens, my colleagues from the health clinic, and Tom's family and friends who had welcomed me warmly despite the unusual circumstances of our meeting. As I stood in my new apartment, looking out at the mountains and thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point of peace and security, I realized that losing my original family had actually freed me to create a much better life than I could have ever had if their betrayal hadn't forced me to become completely independent and self-reliant. The money I had recovered from the house sale, combined with my income as a nurse practitioner, gave me financial security that was based on my own efforts rather than family promises that could be broken at any time. The legal battle had taught me that standing up for justice and truth, even when it's expensive and emotionally devastating, is always the right choice in the long run. People who are willing to lie, steal, and betray trust will eventually face consequences for their actions, but only if their victims have the courage to fight back and demand accountability. The temporary pain of exposing family secrets and challenging family dynamics had led to permanent freedom from manipulation and exploitation. Most importantly, I had learned that real family relationships are based on love, respect, and mutual support rather than shared DNA or legal obligations. The people who had stood by me during the most difficult period of my life, who had helped me fight for justice and truth, and who had celebrated my recovery and success were my real family. Tom, Diana, Rebecca, Mark, and my colleagues at the health clinic had proven their loyalty and care through their actions rather than their words or promises. Looking ahead to my wedding with Tom and our plans to buy a house together in Portland, I felt grateful for the hard-learned lessons that had made me stronger, wiser, and more selective about the people I trusted with my heart and my future. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me financially and emotionally had ultimately led me to a life that was more authentic, secure, and fulfilling than anything I had imagined when I was still trying to earn my parents' love and secure my inheritance through sacrifice and loyalty. If you're dealing with family betrayal or property fraud, know that you're not alone and that justice is possible if you're willing to fight for it. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting yourself from people who were taking advantage of your love and trust? Share your thoughts in the comments below, hit the like button if this story resonated with your own experiences, and subscribe for more stories about standing up to manipulation and building better relationships based on honesty and respect. Remember that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the freedom that comes from walking away from people who don't deserve your loyalty, even when those people are family. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you recognize the difference between family members who deserve your trust and those who are just taking advantage of your love.